Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast in Washington, D.C. And these are the day's top headlines. The Security Council approves plans to declare a state of national emergency and restrictions in areas bordering Russia, Belarus and the Donbass.
Alpha Charlie.
President Vladimir Putin warns that Russia's interests and the security of its people are indisputable priority amid the face-off over Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says he regrets that the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is prone to Western pressure. Those comments made during a meeting with the UN envoy. Investigators in suburban Salt Lake City believe a man ordered his 4-year-old child to fire at police officers following a dispute over his order at a McDonald's drive-thru. And Olympic tennis champion Alexander Zverev has been thrown out of the Mexican Open in Acapulco for unsportsmanlike conduct. The world's number 3 made an unprovoked attack on the umpire's chair after losing a doubles match and faces disciplinary action from the ATP Tour. We begin today with news just in from Moscow. Russia is pushing back at US and Western sanctions unveiled against the Kremlin in the last 24 hours, saying they will be met with a strong response that will not necessarily be symmetrical, but will be well calibrated and sensitive for the American side. That statement coming in the last hour from the Russian Foreign Ministry in response to new penalties announced yesterday by US President Joe Biden and other Western leaders. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has scrubbed his planned meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. It was due to take place tomorrow in Geneva. And a meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, brokered only on Sunday night by French President Emmanuel Macron, is also now off. The foreign ministers of the US and Russia were due to meet tomorrow to work on an agenda for that Biden-Putin summit. But the White House press secretary Jen Psaki announced that the US was putting paid to all of that.
Well, we're never going to completely close the door to diplomacy. And at this point, that is certainly not in the plans.
The Secretary of State agreed to that meeting with his Russian opposite number only last week, but the Americans insisted the meeting would only go ahead if Russia held back from invading Ukraine. Now, after the Russian recognition of 2 separatist-controlled regions in eastern Ukraine as independent, the US has called the Russian actions an all-out assault on Ukraine.
Last week, I agreed to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov this week, on February 24th, to discuss our country's respective concerns about European security, but only if Russia did not invade Ukraine. Now that we see the invasion is beginning, and Russia has made clear its wholesale rejection of diplomacy,
is Susan connected?
It does not make sense.
In Moscow, President Putin released a video message for his American counterpart announcing that he is open to dialogue to address what he called the most difficult problems. but warning that Russia's interests will be non-negotiable.
Our country stays open for direct and honest dialogue for the search of diplomatic solutions for the most complex issues. But I will repeat, Russia's interests, our citizens' safety are absolute, so we will continue strengthening and developing our army and navy, increasing their efficiency, providing them with the most advanced equipment.
Russian troops, as you know, have entered Ukrainian territory. Military vehicles were seen on the streets of the rebel-controlled Donetsk. Russia has even ramped up its military activities in southern Belarus, bordering Ukraine. Satellite images show a new deployment of more than 100 military vehicles and dozens of tents for troops being set up in southern Belarus. The images also reveal a new field hospital being added to a military garrison in western Russia that is close to the border with Ukraine.
Military vehicles rumbled through the outskirts of Donetsk early on Tuesday, just hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent statelets. A few hours after that, Russia's parliament also ratified the new treaties with the two separatist regions, a step that in theory could pave the way to Moscow building military bases there. Meanwhile, some residents in Donetsk hope the move will lead to peace.
It is very important for all of us that peace will finally come to our republic and to Luhansk. We just want peace and calm. For us, it is very important. We want to live as one big family together with Russia.
I fought a lot for this land and people to become independent, for this land to be recognized, and for people to live in freedom with the right to say their word, to make their choice and to get what the Republic has been going to for all these years.
Western countries have been warning for weeks that Moscow may be preparing for a possible all-out mass invasion to conquer its neighbour. Russia has long denied this, and Putin's moves so far have stopped short of such a scenario. Even so, Moscow's recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk is seen by Western powers as an illegal step that could extinguish peace negotiations. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv is considering breaking diplomatic relations with Russia as a result. His defense minister Alexei Reznikov also condemned the move.
They did the Latin step. They ruined our territorial dignity, our sovereignty.
Carnegie Europe analyst Judy Dempsey said Russia's moves so far in the Donbass region are a repetition of the pattern it used to seize Crimea in 2014.
The point is, you can't mince words when it comes to troops crossing into an independent sovereign country. This is a kind of second invasion. Using peacekeepers as a misnomer word for this is hardly disguising the fact that this is Russia de facto taking over this part of Ukraine.
Dempsey says the Ukrainian government may be trying to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia, but she warns that the risk of violence simply cannot be ruled out.
Well, let's cross live to WION's US correspondent Susan Tehrani, who joins us again today from New York City. Susan, we heard there that the Russian military build-up absolutely is continuing. We've also heard within the last 24 hours that the Secretary of State is cancelling his meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and that planned Biden-Putin summit is also off. Isn't there a bit of a contradiction, though, between the White House on the one hand scrubbing all of those meetings, but on the other hand saying, as President Biden himself suggested yesterday, that there might still be a narrow window open for diplomacy?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of things to look into this. First of all, in this scenario and in any scenario, perhaps in the last 1.5 years, when it comes to President Biden dealing with foreign policy issues, we should look at what he does and not what he says. And in this case, we see that President Biden has tried to use sanctions as a form of deterrent. This is what his administration says. And he says that we want to use these sanctions as a way to deter President Putin from moving forward, but we leave the door open for dialogue. This has been the playbook of the United States, not only regarding Russia, but other countries that it has imposed sanctions on. It always says that the room is open for a dialogue, whether or not it's intermediary sanctions, introductory sanctions, or hard-hitting sanctions. It always does say that the room is open for dialogue. However, because the red line was drawn last week by this administration that should Russia go into Ukraine in any form, then that summit between Putin and Biden would be scrapped, then the president perhaps at this point has no choice to scrap that meeting, even though perhaps it might have wanted to hold that meeting. And that might have been one of the indications why on Sunday night, when Russia did in fact go into Ukraine and invade Ukraine, it was scrambling to decide whether or not to call it an invasion. And then when making that address to the world, President Biden called it, quote, a start of an invasion. But some are wondering whether or not the Biden administration is continuously moving the goalpost in order to, yes, leave open room for some sort of dialogue, but also adhere to his critics. Remember, he does have critics at home, and it is an election year here in the United States as well. So he has to consider that on the one hand, play the deterrent card on the other, and also send a hard-hitting signal to Vladimir Putin and the world as well. So yes, contradictory indeed, but not unprecedented.
So let's talk about some of those hard-hitting signals that the White House did send yesterday, because they did unveil what President Biden is calling a first tranche of sanctions. Some of them reached into the Kremlin, personally targeting some close friends and associates of Vladimir Putin. But there is a debate underway, isn't there, inside the administration and outside it, about just how much of the sanctions arsenal that you've prepared do you fling at Russia now, or to what extent the United States ought to be calibrating its response and waiting to see what Vladimir Putin does next? What's the balance in that discussion that's taking place at the moment?
Right. I mean, some are arguing that these sanctions against Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin and Moscow in general were weak. It's not going to deter Vladimir Putin. I mean, President Biden himself even made that comment during the speech. He said, what we did today is probably not going to deter Vladimir Putin from staging an all-out incursion into Ukraine, but quote unquote, I hope I am wrong. But for whatever reason, he has his policies. I guess it's deterrent, as we mentioned earlier. He decided to take these first step measures. The majority, I think on Capitol Hill at least, think that the sanctions should have been more hard-hitting. It should have at least gone after some sort of, higher echelons of the financial institutions inside Russia. And, these oligarchs inside Russia, they're for the most part used to Western sanctions. They're okay with living with the fact that they're not going to be coming to Europe or the United States anytime soon. But in defense of the Biden administration's sanctions, some are saying, and they're saying that this move against the two targeted banks, the VEB, this is the country's main development bank, and it was the first time perhaps that the United States had fully cut off a state-owned Russian financial institution. And what this signifies perhaps is that the Biden administration is willing to cut off major Russian banks from the U.S. financial system because the Biden administration and President Biden said that this is the start of an invasion. Perhaps this first move indicates that this was, as you mentioned, a first step of those sanctions. But also, again, you know, it remains to be seen whether or not it would deter Vladimir Putin or not. Just one caveat before I finish, that sovereign debt, regarding Russia's sovereign debt that the president made such a big deal of, it says in the fine print in the Treasury Department that it starts from March 1st. That means any sovereign debt before that, Russia can still work on. That is a lot of money.
Interesting. And it was also notable last night that a senior administration official asked whether the US government might personally sanction Vladimir Putin, said all options remain on the table. Susan Tehrani, WION's correspondent, joining us live from Manhattan this morning. Thanks very much indeed for that. Now, preparing for a potential all-out Russian offensive amid rising threats, Ukraine's Security Council today approved plans to declare a state of national emergency throughout the country. The regions of conflict, Donetsk and Luhansk, have had a state of emergency in place since 2014. The measure requires stepped-up documents and vehicle checks, among other things. The national state of emergency must be formally approved by Ukraine's parliament. A vote is expected in the coming days. The country's Security Council called it a preventative measure. Kiev is also mobilising its military reserve. More than 200,000 reservists have been put on notice, told they will receive summons to return to their units. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is vowing that his country will not cede an inch of territory to Russia.
На сьогоднішній день немає потреби у загальній мобілізації. Нам необхідно оперативно доукомплектувати українську армію та інші військові формування. Мною, як Верховним Головнокомандуючим Збройних сил України, видано указ про призов резервістів в особливий період. Шановні громадяни, українці, мирна нація, ми хочемо тиші. Але якщо ми сьогодні промовчимо, то завтра зникнемо. Нас чекає щоденна важка робота. І ми до неї готові.
The Ukrainian parliament also voted to approve a draft law that gives permission to citizens to carry firearms and act in self-defense. Ukraine has urged its approximately 3 million citizens living in Russia to evacuate the country. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba believes that Putin's ultimate goal is to destroy Ukraine and suggested that sanctions won't be enough to divert the Kremlin from that goal.
Plan A is to utilize every tool of diplomacy to deter Russia and prevent further escalation. And if that fails, Plan B is to fight for every inch of our land and every city and every village.
Meanwhile, shelling between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists has intensified in eastern Ukraine. The frontline town of Shastya has been under artillery fire for several days now.
У нас очень много поуезжало, очень много. То поумирали, то поуезжали, ужас один, пустой город. Было 15 тысяч, а сейчас, я не знаю, хоть 1000 осталось. Только вот с сыном, с внуком разговаривала, бабушка, вышлю деньги, выезжайте в Киев.
A school in eastern Ukraine is practicing evacuation drills and first aid. This in the wake of a possible assault by the Russian military.
This is a school in Kharkiv, a city in eastern Ukraine. Its students are learning about bulletproof vests and explosives. Evacuation drills and first aid practices are also underway, while some attend presentations of mines and grenade dummies. This as Ukraine prepares for a possible big assault by Russia, with some innocent students still ignorant of the enormity of war.
It was a bulletproof vest, a helmet and a metal detector. Well, it was a bit heavy and it was quite funny doing this in front of friends.
But for some, the situation is indeed scary.
This is quite relevant given the situation that is generally developing between Ukraine and Russia. Yes, scary, very scary. Discussing what's going on in general, we discuss when the incursion might happen, whether it will happen at all, and what to do in general when it happens, if it happens.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has identified Kharkiv as a possible Russian target. And now, after Moscow's recognition of two separatist regions in the former Soviet republic's east, the stakes are getting higher. And that's why authorities are taking no chances.
Well, it has always been popular, but now we have started giving those drills for children more often to prevent situations such as children getting injured or, God forbid, death.
Kharkiv is home to tank, aircraft and tractor factories. It lies 40 kilometers from the Russian border. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Now, in other news, the United States will soon have a truckers' protest of its own. Inspired by their Canadian counterparts, US truck drivers are gathering in California and are planning to drive over 2,500 miles to Washington, D.C. The organisers call themselves the People's Convoy, and the drive to the nation's capital is expected to take 11 days to complete. All of this to protest against President Biden's COVID restrictions and mask mandates.
By the week, probably $4,000, so once we get rolling, it's $680 a day to fill the truck up. So food and stuff out there on the road, it adds up, but it's just kind of a necessity right now. We need to do this for our country.
Stand up for freedom. I don't feel like what the government's trying to enforce with vaccinations and overinflating everything. I don't feel it's right. I feel like things need to go back to a more simple way of life, I guess.
According to organisers, the Washington-bound convoy is expected to arrive in the US Capitol on March the 5th. The Pentagon is expected to approve the deployment of up to 800 unarmed National Guard troops to the nation's capital. It remains to be seen if the US convoy will seek actively to shut down the streets of Washington, D.C. in the way their Canadian counterparts did in Ottawa.
That brought a tear.
And that's all we have time for today for this edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. There is so much going on worldwide. You are going to want to stay very close to WION World is One.
This is right, Arab.